from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
This is the month, January, that many legislatures meet around the United States to start another session, and also it's significant the fact that it's following our elections back in November, and a lot of new items on the agenda. Many states are also swearing in new governors as the governors and the legislature work on the policies of that state. We're very pleased today to bring you a program in which we have two guests that are certainly highly qualified to discuss the opening session of the Idaho legislature. And for our viewers outside the state, you may or may not be aware that also we have a new governor taking office in Idaho as the legislative session opens up. Dirk Kempthorne is the new governor of Idaho. I'm very pleased to welcome to our program, first of all, Idaho State Senator Gordon Crow. He represents the 3rd Legislative District, which encompasses most of Coeur d'Alene and Hayden Lake here in North Idaho. And Senator Crow is gracious to be with us every year. This has become an annual program in which we open up January with his information for us and sharing with the people around Idaho what he anticipates will happen in the legislature. And Senator Crow, welcome back. I'm very happy you're with us.
Always happy to be here. Thank you.
And second, I'm very pleased to welcome to the program Steve Ahrens, who is the Executive Director of the Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry. And I've known Steve for a number of years, and it's welcome you to North Idaho. And thank you for being on the program. You have a very expansive knowledge of some of the things we want to talk about, such as revenue and budgets and appropriations today.
Thank you.
I also want to say to our viewers that my guest asked me to say to you that they're on tour at the time of taping the program with the North Idaho Chamber of Commerce tour, and I believe they've been to the mines and all today, and I think they're dressed fine, but they wanted everybody to know why they're not in tie, and so I'm happy.
I do own a tie and a suit, so.
I know Senator Crow does because I've seen him with them on a lot of times. And as always, I'm very pleased to have Janelle Burke with us, who's our regular panelist, and we'll ask Janelle to commence the questioning about the 1999 Idaho legislative session.
One of the things that, of course, is foremost on everyone's mind is the state of the economy in Idaho. And so let's start with Senator Crow. Can you tell us what you consider to be the state of the economy? And then perhaps something from Mr. Ahrens with regard to why it is a strong economy, since I'm assuming that you're going to say that.
You know, we have had a strong economy for several years now, and we've been, when you look at the whole decade of the 90s pretty much, we've been riding a pretty good economic tidal wave through Idaho, and even when the rest of the country had some downturns, we seem to be an economic island unto ourselves and progressing with that. We might be heading into some bad news, though, and some of the budget crunchers, some of the people who crunch the numbers and do the budgets in the state, where I think we're looking a little tighter budget this year than in any of my first 2 terms in the Senate. Evidently, people Steve works with outside of government, and both people outside of government, people inside of government, saying generally due to downturns in agriculture and other caveats in the economy, we're probably going to be heading into the toughest year I've had to face on that.
That's right, Janelle. Particularly down in the southern part of the state and across over to the eastern part, when we talk about a softening economy, the agricultural community doesn't see anything soft in the numbers. They're in desperate situation over there. We see the prospect of a rising number of bankruptcies, in fact. It's that severe. So at the very least, you can say that the revenues coming into the state this month, as they start working on the FY 2000 budget, are going to be severely more challenged than the revenues have in the past few years. And there's some reasons why, and maybe we can talk about that now.
Yes, would you please? What are the reasons for this?
What everybody focuses on, and rightly so, is the economy that produces the revenues that the legislature uses to make the budget. There's a factor I mentioned to Tony in advance of this show that I would like to point out here, because many times people forget it, and it affects the amount of money the legislature has to devote to the budget. In 1995, Governor Phil Batt and the legislature passed a law that diverted to state funding 1 mil of what was then the 4 mills at the local level on the property tax. The state absorbed the responsibility for that 1 mil. In doing that, the state had to pay for the cost of replacing that, and that first year it cost about $40 million. As prices, assessments go up each year, the cost of replacing that 1 mil goes up. So from 40, the next year it went to about 45, The next year it's to about 49. The next year it's to about 50. This year it's about 55. And I'm anticipating that for FY 2000 it'll be about 60 million more or less. Now that is property tax relief, so that's the good news. However, it costs the state out of its revenue pot to replace that, so that's going to divert 60 million more or less right off the top of the available revenues before the legislature ever starts work on the budget. So in a year when we're already talking about a softening economy, we're saying, and it's going to have to absorb a $60 million impact before we start work on the budget.
And you add on top of that the downturn in agriculture throughout the world, really, throughout the United States, certainly, and definitely in Idaho. Yet on top of that, the slippery slope we've seen in high-tech industries, the Microns of Idaho and the Zylogs and the other companies like that that have seen decreased growth, is all of this is going to come to impact it. So it's going to be a heavy lifting year with regards to the budget.
Let me interject here too. There's something else that Janelle wasn't privileged to know. There's something else can come off the top of that too, depending on whether or not they implement the rainy day fund. Would you also take time to show us we're talking another sum of money that would be removed before Senator Crow and others could appropriate the budget?
That's right, Tony. When people talk about the state's revenue projection, that's the number, the dollar revenue that they have to make the next budget out of. A lot of things come right off the top of that, though, and most people don't ever see those. The legislature never sees them. There are diversions of sales tax revenue back to the local governments. Right. So the legislature only deals with what's left after these diversions. This year, the first decision the legislature will have to make is a new one. In 1998, the legislature passed a bill that created a formal budget reserve account. That's the formal name of it. We've called it the Rainy Day Fund in the past. And the law requires that every year there is surplus of over 4%, I believe the number is. Then 1% of that surplus automatically must be diverted to the state's general fund before the legislature starts the budget-making process. It comes right off the top. Nobody can get at it. This year, we're guessing that the surplus may be about 4%, so the transfer may kick in, and if it does, then there goes about $16.5 million in a revenue-challenged year before the legislature ever starts setting the budget. Now the law allows the legislature by a simple majority vote to stop that diversion. But that still is going to be one of the very first decisions that the legislature has to make, whether they will allow the diversion, if they do, how they will make up for it, and so that's going to be a tough budget decision.
Well, I want to continue on a few more things dealing with the budget and the surplus. I don't want to confuse individuals. No, we are saying, Senator Crow, that there are actually more dollars that will be coming into the state than there were in the last year's budget. But with these things that Steve's talked about, and then secondly, almost all departments indicate we don't have a great inflation problem, but there's a small inflation rate, and there's infrastructure issues and so forth. So would you go a little bit further into detail to say to us, how do we manage meeting the request of budgets? How do we look at that? And in any way, does that suggest any form of new taxes or tax increases?
I would say new taxes probably, in considering the FY 2000 budget in 1999, probably will not be on the table. But what bears remembering also, go back to 1995 when Governor Batt was sworn into office, and as Steve and all of us are fond of remembering, he is the tightwad governor. He's pared this back down.
Self-described.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's what he calls himself, and he's proud of it. And he's pared these budgets back, particularly in the executive branch, down to bone, truthfully down to bone. But through inflationary requirements, through new programs, through old programs that grew faster than we thought they were, and through some federal mandates, and also through some devolution of power back to the states, is those budgets tend to grow as well. You throw inflation on top of that. So what we're looking at here is a revenue stream that is slowing down. The growth in it is slowing down. It's still growing, but it's slowing down to a point that the synergy that came out of these previous budgets aren't going to be here. And those previous budgets were based on bare bones needs out there. And both of you are well aware of some of the reforms we've done on social welfare programs and other issues. One of the most hotly debated issues last session in 1998 was the child health insurance program, the CHIPS program. We've had an interim committee looking at it through the last summer. They're coming in with recommendations that, albeit they could possibly be austere in that, we may not have the money to pay for that. So we have some real tough decisions to make on real everyday problems that affect every Idahoan. It's not going to be enjoyable.
For both of you, I'll throw out two other issues on the table that affect the budget process. And although I know that the policy in Idaho has been that facilities of public education are funded at the local level, and we talk about bond issues, and that's another issue comes up, but we do have some studies to say that there's, in some school districts in the state, there's some really dilapidated facilities. And I throw on the table the other issue is our infrastructure, and I know that Representative Kellogg from North Idaho and Senator Jack Riggs from North Idaho both have spent a lot of time on the issue of Highway 95, and Governor Cecil Andrus used to call it the goat trail, and we've worked on some of it, but he still has a lot of needs. When we look at long range of our infrastructure needs, such as highways and then our building facilities and all, where are we headed? I don't mean in 1999, but would you both respond to that? Maybe we'll start with Steve and say, long range, what are we going to do with some of these issues?
Tony, one of the real issues this session will be the issue that's been here for 5 or 6, particularly, that's the school facilities maintenance and construction. The study that was done 5 years ago or 6 years ago that showed about a $700 million shortfall. That shortfall has never been addressed. There have in the meantime been some bond elections that have passed around the state that perhaps reduce that number. But the basic problem still is there and still must be addressed in the future in some way. I don't see a prospect of a tax increase to do that. And right now, when we're talking about the revenues from a softening economy getting hard pressed, I just don't see an answer to that problem at this point.
Senator Crow?
Yeah, as far as the school facilities needs go out around the state, that study, as Steve mentioned, was done in 1992, and they identified roughly $700 million in facilities needs around the state. Since 1992, by the way, we've passed $600 million in local school bonds around the state. Does that mean that the remaining need is $100 million? Probably not. I'm sure it's more than that because other needs have arisen since that. It's something we have been talking about, even on the North Idaho tour. Both houses of the legislature and media have been talking about where we're going to get at this. I personally like to see, try and determine again where our needs are right now. There's been some talks about allowing for emergency repairs and alterations out there, some sort of statutory allowance for a local school district to declare emergency. There's some other issues that have come up.
Like the supermajority?
Probably the single most talked about issue is the lowering the supermajority to 60%. I know Steve's own organization, the Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry, has had some fairly roundhouse debates on this, and they're not unanimous by any stretch of imagination. The business community isn't on this, and I know in both the Republican and the Democrat caucuses in both houses, they've had a lot of debate on this. In the Senate, in the last 4 years in the Senate, I think 2 or 3 times we've passed the reduction in the supermajority to 60% out. It's been killed in the House. With Governor Kempthorne taking over now, he has mentioned it a couple of times in his campaign, most recently tying it back to election dates and all that is interesting. Do I think it'll get from the 3rd floor in the legislature down the 2nd floor for the governor's signature? I'd rather guess on next year's World Series champion right now than to guess on that.
Well, the Red Sox have a chance?
I think they've got a real good chance.
I think that you could predict the Yankees and probably be a little safer position. No. If they keep that team together. Yeah. One other thing before I go back to Janelle, and it has to do with infrastructure and transportation. President Clinton has been successful with he and the Republican Congress together in putting forth a rather large package for highway construction. And more money is going to come to each state, including Idaho. But I hear rumors that we might be considering lowering the gasoline tax in the state. Would you react to that? And what kind of money we need, and what's the future in that area?
In 1997, we passed the 4-cent increase in the 4-cent per gallon increase in the gas tax, and it wasn't a fun process going through that debate, but we passed it, and it was implemented. As you recall, also later that year, or that earlier that same year, we had tremendous flooding up here in North Idaho, and they actually put about $6 million from that, I believe, off the top into repairing the flood damage up here. Over the last couple of years, Senator Kempthorne and Senator Craig and our entire congressional delegation in Idaho have done a good job in getting some of the federal highway dollars back into Idaho. In fact, they got a huge chunk of that money back into Idaho. With a string attached, we have to match to a certain 10 or 15% on the dollar or something to get it. There is some talk in the legislature. We'll find out when we go into session in the next few days how it's going to play out. But there is some sentiment there to repealing some of that 4 cents, maybe half of it, taking 2 cents off of that. As we know, Senator Riggs has advocated adding another couple of cents on top of the 4 cents for putting monies, and the registration fees, put money back into Highway 95. My intuition leads me to believe that in the 1999 session we will probably stay with the 4-cent gas tax and we won't get extra money for 95. But I want to say something very briefly. In the last 8-10 years, Highway 95 is about 10% of the highways in the state of Idaho. They've received nearly 40% of the money, so work is being done. And then occasionally we have an entire mountain slide off out from under it, like up in Bonner's Ferry recently. But it's a tough problem, but we're working towards it.
I would like for Steve Ahrens to be able to speak to that too, and then I'll go back to Janelle.
Tony, I think Gordon covered that very well. I wouldn't have anything to add to it. I
Fine.
don't see a reduction in the 4-cent gas tax. My members, we have about 300 member companies around the state. I haven't heard them clamoring for a reduction. I think they're pleased with the improvements that are taking place all across the state in our transportation system.
Janelle Burke.
I don't want to talk about money too long. I want to give you an opportunity to talk about our quality of life in Idaho, because we do have a very unique and wonderful way of life in Idaho. I know that there's much interest in our water quality, our air quality. What do you anticipate that the legislature is going to do about some of these kinds of things? Will there be much attention, or will there be more attention in the direction of economics rather than quality of life? Or do you see them as being so intertwined you can't divorce them?
You know, they really are. The environment has been at the top of the list of discussion items for the 4 years previous that I've been in the legislature. Maybe not the way that some of your more ardent environmentalists like, or maybe not the way some of your more ardent non-government or anarchists believe out there and all that, but we have worked. As you know, Governor Batt, once taken office, instructed the Division of Environmental Quality and other agencies charged with working with the environment in the state to get with business and to work things out, to work hand in glove, instead of finding people doing things wrong and finding people doing things wrong and work with them to do them right. And I think it's paid off in the long run. North Idaho, as you both well know, is going to be a huge part of this emerging picture, as our population in Kootenai County alone is predicted it'll double in the next 8 to 10 years. And we have that sole source aquifer sitting out here between us where we're sitting today and the state of Washington, and we're going to have some heavy lifting on that account as well, making decisions there.
One of the most significant issues we're going to be dealing with in the near future, it's just started, and most people haven't picked up on it yet. There is developing what amounts to an issue war between the Federal Environmental Protection Agency and the Idaho Division of Environmental Quality over the implementation and enforcement of Idaho's environmental laws. As Gordon outlined, we've been very pleased, the business community, with the government system over the past few years, because we think we're making serious strides in the state in protecting the environment and doing so in a reasonable fashion that allows the businesses to stay in operation in a profitable way. The feds are now showing evidence that they're going to impose their will on the state environmental enforcers in a way that mandates punishment, mandates fines. In fact, in a couple of cases that already have developed, they're going back many years to fine a company for violations that in those time frames were not violations. There were no laws against those acts. So I see a real problem developing here, and in the near future, and for perhaps a series of years, that's going to be a significant quality of life issue. There are two kinds of quality of life. There's an environmental quality of life, and there's an economic quality of life. Both are important.
Do you think that certain industries are more likely to be a part of that debate than other industries? Do you find that to be the case? In other words, is mining, timber, some of the North Idaho industries more involved in that, or is agriculture as involved?
The debate over those issues involves all of those natural resource industries. And it's just a matter of which rule we happen to be talking about today. But yes, the natural resource industries all are heavily affected by the environmental rules and by the environmental enforcement actions.
But in terms of like your computer industries that are heavily involved in the Boise area, those probably are not as involved in that, or are they also affected?
Janelle, they also are affected. Much more than just the natural resource parts of the economy must comply with environmental rules and regulations. IACI, the Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry, has an environmental committee, for example. And on that committee sit not just the companies that you think of, the mining, the timber, the agricultural companies, but also representatives of Micron Technology and the other businesses that have to meet environmental rules and regulations, even though we don't normally think of them in that context.
Just a short follow-up to that, and that's with the whole idea of recreation in Idaho, which is also a big industry, the tourist industry. What do you foresee happening in that area, parks and recreation, that sort of thing?
Well, the Department of Commerce has certainly played a large role in that throughout the state since its establishment many years ago and all. I would say that the best way the state can play a role in that, from a purely partisan point of view, is for us to keep from trying to run the system and keep from trying to inhibit their ability to run the system. All that, obviously, in this area, along with the natural resource industries and the emerging clean industries that we're trying to recruit to northern Idaho, that tourism and recreation-based industry is a large part of our portfolio. It's increasingly so throughout Idaho, particularly with the Olympics coming to Salt Lake in 2 years. It's going to be a huge issue down there. We've already heard about it on budgetary matters and the like.
Another issue that will not go away, and we talked before the program with both of you, it'll be in this session. It's all over the country, and the state of Washington is dealing with this in their legislature. And there's been some recent developments in the inland Northwest concerning health care. And there's a lot of new ways of looking at regulation and funding. And I believe this year in the Congress of the United States, there'll be a tremendous debate on HMOs and where we're going. Senator Crow, we'll start with you. Would you update us what you think? And as I indicate with the viewers, we're taping this in November, right, fairly early November. By the time it airs in early January, there may be more developments. But the Idaho legislature will be addressing some questions about health care, will they not?
Right, we will. As we were discussing session before last, we passed managed care reform, fairly strident managed care reform in the state of Idaho that affected the managed care providers.
Very strident.
Yes, very strident, as his insurance members have pointed out to me time and time again, but more commonly referred to in the general media as HMOs. We're seeing some vestiges of that now, to where premiums are increasing because I believe, and I know Steve and his members believe, because of some of the laws we passed. So I think we're going to be revisiting that. Basically, the providers out there for managed care are finding that anywhere from 20 to 30% of their customers are using 100% of the services. However, they have to level the premiums across 100% of the demographic. And so you're having people whose premiums are going up overnight as much as 40%. And so we need to get back into that and fine-tune it. As well as on health care, as you know, Tony, 2 years ago I spent an entire year on Medicaid reform. We have just kind of bitten off the first smidgen of that in the last few years as far as the Medicaid reforms. I think you'll see a lot more of that coming out in the next session, particularly that which allows people to get more in-home care and more in the community care and all that than we've had before.
Steve, would you like to address that issue?
Tony, healthcare is a significant cost factor for the business community. Employers pay for, provide a major share of the healthcare benefits that employees use. So on the face of it here, there's no argument about the need for healthcare, no argument about the need for benefits. The problem is the cost of providing those, because there simply are limits to how far this company or that company can go financially in continuing to pay the benefit programs it has worked out for the benefits of its employees. So the cost factor is just very critical here. And it's not about ripping off anybody or preventing anyone from getting quality health care. It is about cost. And as costs go up, it is inevitable that some other change must occur there. Either a reduction in the programs, which nobody wants to see, or an increase in the copay that the employees must provide. They don't want to see that. Or the total cessation of the benefit programs from the employer's standpoint. And I don't think either side wants to see that. So this cost thing is very serious.
You know, we've not had a real serious inflationary problem in this country for a number of years now. the cost in medical care has been above the average.
Rising rapidly.
Part of that's the research and technology. There's a lot of factors for it, but that's also complicating the picture, is it not?
I think we saw nationally the costs were rising sharply. They leveled off, and for a period of years, particularly as managed care became a greater and greater factor, the costs seemed to be slowing. Now they're beginning to take off again, and that's a point of concern.
Janelle Berg.
One of the things that the legislature also addresses almost every year is something about the domestic parts of our lives, that is the family law portion, and there's been a lot of talk about the marriage tax. What do you anticipate is going to happen, or do you know?
Well, 2 years ago, on the last week of the session, I sat in Governor Batt's office with Representative Dan Mader out of Lewiston and encouraged him as strongly as we could to sign the elimination of the marriage tax penalty in Idaho. And at that time, Governor Batt, in his very fiscally austere way, said that's $16 million hit. We're not going $16 million hit. We're not going to do it, and he did veto it. Governor Kempthorne campaigned on his belief that we should eliminate the marriage tax penalty. The bill in '97 actually got through both houses with a veto-proof majority, but we didn't get down to the second floor to the governor's office until it was too late to come back and override a veto, which eventually was vetoed. My anticipation is that Governor Kempthorne will look at it after he talks to his people in the Division of Financial Management and some of the other auditors around. Maybe we'll sit down and discuss it some more with the budget crunch we're doing. My hope is we'll go ahead with it.
What does it really mean? We have a very limited, small amount of time, but what is it really? What would it mean?
The marriage penalty?
Yes.
The simple fact is that married couples face a comparative tax disadvantage to single people. It's the same federally as it is at the state level. I should point out that my association has no position on this issue, but in response to your question, I think it's...
Tell us what you and your wife think about this issue.
I agree with the governor. But it's unlikely that, again, a revenue-challenged year that we'll see any major address of this problem, perhaps something phased in.
Maybe a portion of it.
On that note, I have to bring the program to conclusion. On behalf of Janelle Burke and our staff, I want to thank Senator Gordon Crow and Stephen Ahrens, the Executive Director of the Idaho Association for Commerce and Industry. It's been very much fun to have you on the program. We've covered a lot of important issues. There's a lot we didn't get covered, and Senator Crow, when the session's over, we hope you'll come back, and Steve, maybe you can come back too, and we will continue to review what did happen. We thank you very much for taking time from the North Idaho tour to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this program. I believe you have, and I would like to say in the other states, I'm sure you're also looking at what you're doing this session, and I would like to invite each of you to be with us again next week when we will discuss yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.